Hi Al, really great to have you on board. Do you know what? If I'm being really frank, I feel massively privileged. I follow you, I follow everything you talk about. You obviously written a number of books, and we've just talked about before. You're on to your fourth one, and I think you definitely challenge and spark a lot of conversation around the edtech market and education as a whole as well. So I'm really pleased to have you on board. So thank you very much for giving us some of your time.
Well, it's my pleasure, Nick, and it's nice to be introduced as that noisy bloke that sometimes causes trouble. So I'll take that.
Excellent. Oh man, so I really want to because of the time we have, I really want to sort of dive in straight away to some of the, I think, really interesting topics at the moment. And I think one of those topics, which I think, and I want to sort of start quite high up, and I
Yep.
think overall sort of education and where education should be. And I really want to get your views on, as an example, I feel at the moment, schools are used for multiple different purposes. And there's lots of talk about sort of changing education and changing schools on the side, like for maybe changes to curriculum as it's happened already before, and how we should be assessing and all that sort of noise. But sometimes I think we need to go back to basics and actually understand what schools are going to be for. Because at the moment, I think there's an element of, we use them for childcare, we use them for social care. There's so much more. Where do you think education, and this is such a big, broad question, but where do you see education going, or where do you think it needs to go over the course of the next sort of 5, maybe 10 years even?
It's a really uncomfortable question, isn't it? Because there's if you had the magic sauce that you could just wave a wand and make changes, you might do things differently. I try and give the example that, if you think about education and you think I was starting afresh and I had that all powering role sitting over the globe, then it wouldn't be unreasonable to say, based on what's available to me and based on what the geography and the different cultures and the different needs of all our learners, that my education system would probably be something that was quite digital
Mm.
to mitigate the geography, to be able to share my teaching experience and resource that I have available to me, to make sure that all children had access to something that would stimulate and support learning, would broaden their horizons. Absolutely now would be much more shaped around developing their skills, those things that are most important to what the employers want of the future, and that definitely changes. And I suppose in a roundabout way of coming to it, I remember listening to a presentation by Siddhartha Mitra that many will be familiar with from his hole in the wall experiment. But he kind of had that conversation and asked the question, if we were 300 years from now, would we be looking back in the same way as, I think he used the references of horsemanship and swordsmanship was obsolete, and say, hey, the way we used to learn was in a room with a person at the front. Now, that's really easy to say and say, so yeah, digital, we just all sign into an online course. Of course, the reality is there's far, far more that a school offers to a young person than just the delivery of curriculum and a learning experience. And your point kind of sways towards the fact that actually there is a much, much larger remit and responsibility on schools and educators now than there ever has been before. Maybe in the UK, we could roll back 5, 10 years and say, well, the closure of Sure Start centres and other mechanisms to protect our children at their very youngest age, and their families for that matter, creates more pressure in terms of the social care. We can kind of say, and I always say government policy, I don't think always creates the ultimate problem, but it's always typically the enabler that brings it to the fore. So we can say, because of lack of funding, we don't have the capacity and resource to deliver a full educational experience. And that's really key, because an experience is something different to every learner. And we can look in our system and we can say, well, we've got bricks and mortars primary and secondary schools, and we've got alternative provision for children that struggle in mainstream, and we've got specialist provision. And then, of course, we've got other flavors of schools, whether they're private or public, that sit. But fundamentally, we try and make sure that every child fits in a box. And the general narrative, because of capacity, because of funding, because of the predefined rubric of the curriculum, says every child's got to fit into one of those boxes. And the reality is there are plenty of children that don't quite, work in that scenario. And so government policy on funding creates an exasperation on what's happening within the capacity in our education systems. Pressures on social care mean that more time is spent in schools doing the things that fundamentally is, until a child's in the right place and space and mindset to learn, then the effective delivery of pedagogy, frankly, is a little bit of a secondary matter, So there's that kind of layered approach that I think sits there. And then you've also got a broader picture, which is, do we actually value education anymore? Because this is a conversation that goes to parents. Why do we suddenly have a much more pressing problem with attendance and disengaged learners? Well, in some cases, it's because young people don't think that school, as we traditionally think it, fits, and they find that it's either something that they struggle with and it creates anxiety, or they disengage because they just don't resonate and reflect with it. But we've also got a cohort of parents who are now starting to say, my child could get a different kind of education. That'll be fine for them. Or my job's changed, so I work from home quite a lot, so I can be able to spend more time with my child in different ways. And so all these things mix up into this question of, we keep talking about education with the mindset of a fixed classroom and a teacher and 30 students, and everything else is built around that. When in truth, the actual fundamental bit that's important in a school, it's a little bit like that disconnect between having an Ofsted inspection and meeting a head teacher. An Ofsted inspection measures, have you completed all these tasks about assessment in terms of a child's learning and progress and attainment and so on? And you ask a head teacher or a chair of a governor's or anybody, frankly, in a school, and they'll say, my place is a caring, sharing space where every child can be themselves, where they have opportunities to develop skills and experiences, where we have strong community engagement, we have good links with business, but fundamentally, we aspire to respect the visions and values of all of our children. Now, those two lists are completely different lists. That's what's important to us, and that's what we're measured on. So I would argue the first thing is we need to change the measures. And without rambling, but that's what I am guilty of on a frequent occasion, the glass is full. We've already put the full list of expectations on what we're asking of schools and some. So the only way we can develop and add in the value of those other things that are actually most dear to us for human beings is to tip something out the glass. Ask less of the curriculum to provide more of the personal development and skills. And then when you go to an employer and you say, I'm looking for a job, and the employer says, well, the things I want from you are your critical thinking skills, your resilience, your communication skills, your ability to evidence and informs, your imagination and creativity, you think, oh, I thought they were going to ask me what GCSEs I've got. and therein is the disconnect as we move to a more digital age where human skills are more valuable and stand out more because there is more technology doing the mundane evidential researching and analytic work. So that's my rambling that says the education system of the future needs to be much more flexible. It needs to be something that allows the benefit of human interaction, but can flex to support different learner styles, and a curriculum where you are rewarded for breadth of offer, not narrowness of measure in order to allow you to conform on league tables. And my final bit on that from my long waffle would be, governments make decisions based on comparing themselves to other countries. How's our workforce doing? And so typically governments don't change when everybody else is doing the same thing. And overarching that, we currently have the PESA rankings, the OECD, that says this is how we're going to measure schools, high-performing school systems. They're now looking at that change. The latest iteration and the work that's being done by the OECD is about an education system that promotes human flourishing, one that develops the context of measuring skills acquisition and critical thinking beyond simply knowledge retention. So I think there's a precedent that allows us to flex that way. And you'll see it here in the UK. We're also starting to see online offers, accredited schools offering provision that means we can find a different way to engage with learners that struggle in different settings.
So I think that wasn't waffling. I think that was really, really concise, but amazing as well. And so do you potentially see the idea that, oh man, how are you going to see government do this? So is it a case of just literally chucking everything that we know now out of the box? Or is it a case of, and sort of trying to move towards more individualized learning and sort of going, actually, we will have, for these children who aren't coming into school, we're going to have much more of a blended sort of learning sort of experience. these children over here, no, they do like being in amongst the sort of a classroom sort of type of sort of scenario. So actually, we're going to have to then bend and change our curriculum for them, those children as well. So, and by the way, I'm a massive advocate of individual learning, but I'm not trying to lead you down a path. But do you see that schools are going to have to be much more flexible?
There's two parts in there. Individual learning. I mean, people often talk about learning, and there'll be names that come along. People like Bloom's taxonomy, and we talk about things. But Bloom's, for example, Benjamin Bloom, for those that aren't familiar, I'm sure most will be. One of the pieces that resonates quite well is the 2 sigma problem. That research that he did back in the 80s that identified that there was typically 2 deviations of progress for a child that was being taught on a one-to-one tutorized basis versus in a group. And how do we mitigate the 2? And I'd argue one of our considerations is, if we were talking about leveling up our education system, is about how do we develop not just that human-to-human collaborative working in a classroom, but how could we perhaps use technology to be that personalized learner? Other phrases that come along is, you move from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. They're all kind of fundamentally around, are we using levers? The big challenge is, I don't believe it's about a revolution. I think it's very much about evolution. When we talk about our education system, there's a natural conversation like this to talk about the challenges without recognizing there's a whole raft of things that are being done really, really well. And, most of our children arrive at the end of their educational journey largely equipped for the future world, and they're well-rounded and resilient young people. So this isn't a case of throw out the baby with the bathwater. There has to be a recognition that we haven't for many, many years, and this is something that I would say is on a global basis, seen real strength of government and leadership, because the natural persuasion for any government is to introduce policy change and funding that results in some measurable outcome within one electoral cycle. Look what we spent, look what we did, here's a measure, aren't we clever? Whereas everybody who's heavily involved in education would say we need a long-term plan for education. We're talking about a 15-year plus cycle, and therefore we're asking government to commit, invest, and in many regards delegate an education reform program, but not be able to take the credit for it until probably they're out of office and sat somewhere reflecting on what they did. And we've not yet had somebody really in that scheme that's really done it. When we look at high-performing school systems that perhaps we might look to and say, there's some ideas there, we often look to, Estonia and Finland and other countries. But you look at the Baltic states, there was a catalyst and a reason for an educational reform post the communist bloc that allowed them to say, there's a line in the sand here, we've got to fundamentally change our curriculum offer. So now we have the luxury of a little bit more of a blank sheet. And we've actually got a government that says we want to differentiate and do things differently. For the rest of the world, the UK, our education system is based back to the Industrial Revolution and the British Commonwealth. Frankly, we wanted children to learn those core literacy and numeracy skills wherever they were across the Commonwealth, and they could drop into the traditional role, workers' role, with those core skills they needed. It's much harder now. So what we tend to see is, and it links back to capacity in our schools, is that educational reform is actually educational tinkering. We've got an idea. We want to change the way we do this. We want to introduce a particular approach. We want to make sure that everyone focuses on phonics. No, hang on, it's all numeracy. Hang on, it's this. We want to make sure this is happening. And that tinkering around the edges doesn't have a significant change to our actual educational outcomes. And the evidence sits there when we look over a much longer period of time with educational outcomes. And if it does start to change, well, we change the way we measure. And we say, hang on a second, there's too many children doing well. So now we're going to use our deviation across the bandings, and we're going to make sure that only a certain percentage can actually score a level 9. We tinker, we create workload in schools to adapt and change to meet policy, but we're not fundamentally changing what is an issue here of we don't have enough flexibility to create an experience that all learners engage with. We don't have enough time and capacity to provide the nurture that we need to support learners from their social emotional health. And the capacity also means funding. We don't pay or frankly communicate sufficient respect for the profession to have lots of people queuing up to do the job, which is also a problem. And I'm referring there to both teachers and the support staff, which again is an area where there's probably as much, if not more pressure particularly making the wheels of the machine continue to turn effectively. And we have government that tend to criticize and say, oh, schools need to do this. Well, if schools want to get more kids into school, probably we need to start with that social support with families a few years before the child is school age, if we want to really change mindsets and hearts and minds and how we deliver that. So, that's my way of kind of saying that the reality check is, whilst the magic wand moment would be, let's start again. In some aspects, let's build on the core things we do really well. The reality is that's almost certainly never going to happen. And what we're looking at is, what are the core things that we could do? And probably for most educational leaders would say, give us more funding, delegate more accountability so that we can vary our offer based on our school and our community cohort, so that we're not tied into being quite so prescriptive.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third level is, could we have a chat about what we actually mean about a school that is good? Could we change our measure from being one that limits on the academic and doesn't look at the breadth of developing the whole child? And maybe if we could find, schools have to have some kind of accountability. We can't turn around and say, we'd like the funding, we're going to run a school, and nobody from outside can ever come and challenge whether we're doing things well. But we could find more collegiate ways of doing things. I do a lot of work with international schools all over the place. And in the US, they have their NAEP rankings, a little bit like the PISA rankings, but within the US school systems that they do. But interestingly, when a school really struggles on those rankings, the net output of that is they actually get extra funding for interventions. Imagine that. We've come and visited your school. We think you're really struggling with a particular aspect, or there isn't sufficient evidence that you're moving forward your SEN or your EHCPs or whatever it might, whatever your category of measure is. And because we found a problem, we're going to come back and inspect you in 2 years' time. But in the meantime, we're going to give you the funding so that you can get on board an educational psychologist and 2 more teaching assistants. As opposed to, we've got a challenge and you've got no money, but you know what? We're back in a couple of years and good luck. And I'm exaggerating for effect, but there's deviations in education systems that says actually you could make a difference if you were more willing to.
I'm with you completely. I just want to touch back a little bit more back on that sort of revolution or evolution. I think that because I think the thing is that the world is moving on faster and faster. Technology is moving us faster and faster. The fact is, I think it's Stephen Heppel who said, there once upon a time, technology had come along, and he's in Bristol University, will go, well, let's see what we can utilize this technology for. That's not the case anymore. It's a case of the technology's here, it's going to be utilized, and you need to get on board. We don't have time anymore. And I think, there's a number of questions in here. So first of all, are we dealing with the symptom? It's a little bit like attendance. There's this big sort of, kids aren't going back to school, there's an attendance problem. But rather than thinking about the symptom, it's almost a case of, and maybe the way that society is now changing, in the sense of, like you say, there's more parents are working from home, there is some well-being issues there potentially in relation to them having anxiety going into school. I don't think we don't seem to be dealing with the symptom. We seem to be dealing with the problem itself, and it's not the problem. Sorry, we are dealing with the symptom and not the problem. And there's an element of sort of going, do we need to really think about education and sort of go, actually, some of these things are now just the way that society has now progressed. This is the way that technology is progressing, and actually, do we need to review education as a whole, in the sense of saying, well, actually, there is a safeguarding issue, in which case then those kids do need to come in as part of their education. But in this instance, actually, it's a better way for them to learn outside of school. And so actually we do need to basically have a more adaptive, more of an accepting education system that actually works for everybody. And I'm just not sure, can we wait, basically?
Well, given the scale of the education offer and what our school system does, there are some things that are relatively significant in terms of potential impact that are still, in the scheme of things, quite small changes. So, the role of technology, I've always say, is it's not a panacea to anything, but it's absolutely a lever that can help, whether it's economic efficiencies of the operation. We think of multi-academy trusts and large international schools, It can define better use of data to inform teachers and get them working smarter. And there's absolutely a growing range of personalized learning tools that will facilitate, parallel to that human-to-human interaction, development. Now, we could amplify the conversation and say, well, you know what, if we continue to have a growing cohort of children and a reducing cohort of educators, at some point, in order to meet capacity and needs, we might have our children in school 3 days a week and at home 2 days a week, and it's a hybrid model between the two. The question is really, like all things in education, is have we got sufficient evidence that that doesn't have a negative impact, or more importantly, hopefully has a positive impact? So we can use technology in a ways to flex. Absolutely, there is a model that says there is a place and space now for online schools. We have some learners that will simply struggle within a mainstream setting. A few years back, was asked by a local authority to step in and chair an alternative provision, a pupil referral unit, and find a new home for it because of its rather challenging inspection outcomes. You know, and the biggest challenge there was young people come away from mainstream education, go to alternative provision, and they were basically there until they left education. Whereas in truth, they should be there 3 months ideally, and have the right wraparound and care that they get the skills and support they need to get them back on track. And then they arrive back in mainstream with the right support package to make sure that they can continue. So in that sense, sometimes it's not about always changing the space, it's changing the capacity of what's in the space. A young person that right now cannot cope and struggle in a mainstream setting potentially could, if the school had the right resources and funds to care for them. A young person with a challenge that isn't engaged with learning could, if it was okay for them to have a split timetable between home and school, and we looked at different ways of supporting that. As an education system, we shouldn't poo-poo other platforms. We're seeing quite a lot of the international schools and the independent schools starting to offer a hybrid and an online provision. And as long as the evidence holds true that learners are engaging with that, then we shouldn't be afraid of having a more mixed cohort of educational offers in the UK. It's better than a child being disengaged. And whilst I mean no disrespect to parents that choose it, I would suggest it would be a better educational journey than homeschooling a child, unless they're fortunate enough to have parents with the time and the background to provide and impart that wisdom. And they exist too, absolutely. So I think there's definitely a trajectory that says we can flex these things. There's a trajectory that says we can use technology to broaden how we deliver our teaching and learning. We can look and say, actually, what are we trying to learn? Well, the curriculum could be much broader, whether we look on one end and say, you know, we've got esports and all other activities that broaden and provide different pathways to learners.
Yep.
Excuse me. But fundamentally, Nick, at what point do we say you have to learn in a classroom? We seem quite happy to say at university you can be split between the classroom and hybrid, and those qualifications are probably the ones we hold most dear and the highest value. It seems okay at college, certainly at work now. It's okay to work between home and whatever. So why is it that a 17-year-old child in year 13, it's not appropriate to learn in a hybrid model, but a year later at university it is? The reality is sometimes we push back because we're just not sure, or it's a change that we've got to accommodate that we're not comfortable with. Or often in schools, it's not a lack of will, it's back to a lack of capacity. We haven't got the time or the resource to adapt our offer to make sure we can deliver it. And there is a chicken and egg. Well, until you do it, and unless there's evidence and research behind it, it's really hard to find that. So we often see the international and the private schools tend to be ahead of the curve because they've got the means and resource to try these things, and then they filter through. But I still come back to the core, whilst I would not claim to be this be my area of expertise, you know, the pedagogy, the science of learning, the interaction of people, the nurture, the way that questioning and the way that information is imparted on young people is something that is a very powerful human skill. And whilst technology can provide parallel pathways, I think we should hold dear the human factor, that relationship and nurture, because as our world becomes more and more digital or more AI heavy, that will be a real differentiator in terms of the empathy and the level of education we can offer.
I'm totally with you in relation to the sort of soft skills, the EQ. I think ultimately that is going to be the future, because you're right. I think when it comes to re or memorizing data or memorizing facts and information, that we already are in that space where it's easy to grab hold of, and it's going to get easier in the sense of you just be able to ask the question rather than
Yeah.
having to even explore it. So I think that that sort of side of things is. And I agree with you. I think what we need to do is embrace people, or get as many people as possible to want to be lifelong learners. So, how are they going to continue to grow as people, as adults, as children, whoever they might be? That's where we would love, that's the sort of
Yeah.
utopia sort of type of scenario. I just feel, and I think it's the same with technology. I think there's an element of, when I look at ChatGPT 4, and there's this great video on YouTube where a child is learning about how to basically calculate the different angles of a hypotenuse triangle, and he's basically asking the questions of ChatGPT 4. ChatGPT 4 is speaking back, talking, acting as a mentor, sort of going, "Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that?" The dad is beside them, and you sort of go, "Do you know there isn't this is." But again, it comes back to how quickly do we move, because that's already happening, and that will only get better. So you get to this point where you go, if we don't think about where we want education to get to, then technology will move faster than we are. So there's almost that's why
Yeah.
I'm sort of going, is it revolution or evolution, in the sense of technology is now, and I appreciate it's not quite there yet, I don't think, and I think and I'm not trying to say teachers need to be moved out or any of those things out of education. I'm just sort of thinking, we need to almost have a bit of a future gazing and saying, where is technology going to really stand in our education system, and where do our teachers then sit, and where do pupils sit? It's a little bit like I don't know if you know about soft cell in Japan, and I know this is going to sound stupid, but they put robots in classrooms, and that's because kids of a younger age sometimes don't feel embarrassed about going to a robot. So actually, as a teaching assistant, or as
Yeah.
an assistant, going there and saying, "By the way, I've just," it could be anything. It could be, "I just need to go and wash my hands," or it could be, "Do you know what? I feel really sad today because of X, Y, and Z." And it could be, the fact is, this sort of robot is acting as a non sort of accusory, because the trouble is, of sometimes children feel adults are, or humans are, judgmental.
Listen, there's lots to unpick there. I mean,
Yeah.
we could walk into many primary schools in England right now, and you would find a puppy or a
Yeah.
dog that would be in school once a week. And for some of our most vulnerable learners, sitting and reading a book to a non-judgmental dog is something that is far more comfortable and confident. So there's a parallel there, isn't there,
Yeah.
in terms of that? I think AI has really accelerated the conversation, and it's a real double-edged sword for education, because on one hand, we're saying, look, we're under so much pressure, we need to embrace technology to help mitigate some of that pressure. And on the other hand, we're saying, hang on, our commodity is the future workforce, our little people. Do we want to be trying new stuff, or do we want to wait till we've got sufficient evidence and confidence in its efficacy before we deploy that out with our learners? And you know what? There's a list as long as your arm to cover both arguments. So you start to cherry pick. And what I argue in my trust, for example, is where there's technology and tools right now, our number one pressure on our risk register will be recruitment and retention of educators, its staff workload, well-being, and so on. And so we can use technology that might help reduce workload. And then we get into, actually, whether you're a GPT or a Gemini or a Copilot, whatever, assuming you've had the right training and experience and you understand about effective questioning techniques and chat prompting and all the rest of it, there's the potential that it can draft lots of tools for you. There are also loads of great tools out there that in effect are prompt crafted behind the question box to allow you to create reports or draft reports and lesson planning and so on resources. And for me, they kind of get a tick in the box, try them. Within our trust, we kind of say, here are some core tools that you can try. You can create output, but don't upload student data. And what most important is capture what works well and make sure you capture what doesn't work well, so we can share that as a bit of a teach me, and we can develop from that. When we move into the student side, it becomes a bit more challenging in terms of making sure that we're getting the right steer, because we can turn around and say, well, AI provides much quicker responses to questioning and feedback to our learners that can help, and AI can help us with our personalized learning. Probably that's the point that you and I would, in a conversation, would say, don't forget there's generative and non-generative AI. Non-generative AI has been the back end of quite a lot of learning pathway tools for some years. And that's a little bit different in terms of analyzing the data of what a child's already achieved through, typically it's formative assessment, maybe some summative that's recorded in there as well. And it will either stretch and challenge a child or take them back some stages to develop build on their foundational knowledge. On the generative side, we always have this question about data privacy, bias, accuracy, hallucinations. Will it give me the wrong information about it? And so there's an element of, to move that into the practice, first of all, teachers need to be confident with the tools that they're going to ask their learners to use. Secondly, there is a big question of how do we adapt our assessment process, recognizing that children have an opportunity to use a digital third party to help them with the way that they do their homework and other questions. So we need to find ways to adapt our methods for understanding whether a child really has learned content and knowledge. And we also need to develop the child's digital skills to do that safely and effectively, and for them to ask the right questions, or as the example you gave, is to know that with any of the core GPT tools available, your first question can be, I want you to be a history teacher talking to me as a year 11 student in England, and then refining down what kind of information you want. So there is a bit of a stepping stone pathway. I think what happens is people perceive it as a yay or nay. We're either all in or all out. And I think actually it's much more about do some basics, build confidence. Once you've got confidence, build the next layer, rather than necessarily right the way through. So, you know, that kind of context, I think, is one where there's a technological shift that is happening. But you know, go to many trust boards and say, well, we're looking at our priorities for this year, and we look at our school development plan. You'll find digital strategy, digital plans, the role of AI, staff well-being will be on the list. But I promise you, it won't be top. It'll be about our recruitment challenges. It'll be, we've just had the next round of the funding formula. Literally this week, we've just got the final figures for our budgets for the school year that starts in, 2 weeks' time. And we're thinking about costings and how we're going to cover that. And, oh, hang on a second, these teacher increases, pay rises aren't fully funded, and we've got deficits to worry about here. And we'll be thinking about, well, actually, we've got to get attendance up. How are we going to get more of our learners in school? And so the best intention drifts, which is why we kind of need to break down some of these big topics into the baby steps to make it easier for schools to kind of take those stepping stones. Now, I'd also argue the government here, from an England perspective, you know, we've been on a path to academisation. And for many schools, academisation was a change of badge over the door, where they went from an LA school to a SAT, a single academy trust. Frankly, it was a change, and we suddenly were less accountable to the people in our town and a bit more accountable to somebody in our region. But over time, we're seeing a direction of travel to multi-academy trusts of scale, or as you know, the previous Secretary of State of Education, Gillian Keegan, was very focused about strong and sustainable MATs and about scale. And you could argue that where you see some of the best pockets of implementation of innovation, it is in larger multi-academy trusts that have the central team capacity to handle projects, whether it's effective data lakes, pooling your data and providing the right dashboards and insights that come from that, or whether it's having specialists in the effective use of digital, whether it's from a tech or from a pedagogy perspective, or rolling out AI tools with the right training, something which is much harder if you're a single school or a 2 or 3 school cluster, because you typically won't have that central team that you can fund to do those things. So there is a bit of an argument that says if you get to a certain scale, there's more likelihood that you have the capacity to innovate.
Yep.
Now, I would say some of the best schools that I'm asked to go and visit, and typically go to visit because there's a challenge, I'll say sometimes you see some of the most amazing practice in spite of either poor leadership or financial challenges or other bits and pieces. So there's no hard and fast rule that says bigger is better. In fact, I'm quite vocal, much as I do have a role on the Department for Education's advisory board for the East of England, supporting the academies. I don't personally think bigger is better. I think there's a finite size, but I think you can also have diminishing returns when you become huge. But that's a personal perspective, and I'm sure others will have a different view on that. So I think, again, what we're actually then saying is, well, you create the environment, whether it's the funding, whether it's the scale, whether it's the model government, and then step away and let the people that actually have the lived experience and the understanding, allow them more opportunity to actually innovate, and then make sure you capture that innovation to share it back. So we kind of had a program for a couple of years with the demonstrator schools, and that was effective in some places, maybe not as much in others, but there was definitely progress. The second iteration run by United Learning, and then the government said, we're going to stop that. So, without going off on a tangent, which I am guilty of on a regular basis, we're a country that recognizes there's digital coming and this is the future. So what we've done is we've had a period of a couple of years where we've been showcasing best use of technology in schools, and we've said, nah, enough of that. Let's not fund that anymore. We've then given loads of schools devices at the start of the pandemic and said, in terms of when they're all due for a refresh, which is about now, 4-year cycle of all those laptops and Chromebooks and so on, no, we won't bother giving them any capital funding to refresh them. So actually most schools will be saying, never mind more tech, I've got to worry about replacing the stuff I've already got in my diminished budget. So we've got one window saying technology, the future, skills. Yes, as a government, we embrace it, but the practical application is, but we're not actually helping the schools do that at all. And then finally, Nick, just to be contentious, we then say as a government, let's bring together a group of people to form our vision of AI use in our schools and its protocols. And what we'll do is we'll ask some of the key stakeholders from Google, Amazon, Microsoft to sit around the table. Now, they're all amazing companies, lovely people, and I don't wish to single anyone out, but in the sense of, but you're also the ones delivering the system and benefiting from it. I've said it before, and I'm happy to say it with you. I kind of feel like we've got the fox guarding the chickens.
No, I'm totally, everything you're saying resonates at 100% for sure. I think this sort of comes back to, again, it comes a little bit back to stop creating targets when you don't really understand, what the actual, what you want to achieve at the end of it. So I think sometimes with government, I think there's lots of things like, like we say, attendance and so on. But actually, when we understand, first of all, what would we want? How do we want our children to learn, and where do we see the future, and do they have to be in school 100% of the time, or actually is it going back to your point, where we could have a blended scenario where they come into school 3 days and then at home for 2 days, wherever that might be, whatever is the right thing for each child. I think is something we need to consider. I also think, you're right that there's, and actually there's probably a question here as well. Government probably need to listen more to the practitioners, the mats, the people on the schools. I agree with you. I've been in schools where it's a single school, and actually the teachers are being really innovative because of the fact is the pressures they're under. They're under so much pressure, and they're trying to sort of, they've got lack of capacity, as you say, and so their innovation is unbelievable because they're basically sort of going, right, how do I now tackle the number of classes I'm having to deal with, plus all the the added on things like homework, lesson plans, but everything else. So they actually are being really innovative, and actually it might be worth actually understanding what they do. It might be the thing that actually creates also efficiencies in other bigger establishments and bigger sort of mats and so on. So I think teachers are already innovative. But I think there's an element where we don't necessarily listen enough to these practitioners. And actually, if we also gave them the capacity to look wider and go, by the way, did you know this could also do X, Y, and Z for you? Would they take it on board, and would they become, as you say, the evidence and the facts and evidence of this actually works and this doesn't work? Again, it sort of feels like we never really sort of give them the opportunity to go, right, why don't you have a bit of capacity? Why don't we give you a few hours every day, or maybe, well, I'll tell you what, we'll give you a couple of days every month to think about, X, Y, Z. And I know it's because the system is collapsing with capacity, but it feels to me we are, we're not listening enough to those practitioners.
It's lip service, unfortunately. I mean, ironically, many of the things we do in education as a system and for educators completely contradicts what we do in the classroom with learners. So as a general
Okay.
rule, when little Al at the front of the class does something well, the teacher says, look what Al did. Let me show that to the rest of the class. Al, explain what you did and how you did it and why you did it. And then an education system, we're all in little silos. And when somebody figures out how to use a new AI tool to reduce their report workload, well, how does anybody else know about it? We rely on our professional learning networks, and we rely on webinars and discussions like this, and podcasts, and on newsletters, and all the things that we push out as individuals to try and get that sense of where the best practice is. Now, again, I am an advocate in terms of the breaking silos and the joined up approach. There are advantages in a MAT if you've got the right mindset and the right systems, where you can make sure that all of the staff across the MFL departments in the trust are sharing what tool works well and how they've done certain things and best practice. But as a government system, we don't have a system that enables that natural progression of, diplomatically from the very early stage, show and tell. Who's doing amazing stuff? And in a way, that was what the demonstrators program was trying to do. But that was just one strand, because, amazing stuff in classrooms sometimes doesn't involve a jot of technology, and rightly so. In fact, quite often that's the case. So I think creating that platform has put the onus on the individuals to share their experiences, share what's well. And we are lucky. I mean, I always use that analogy. In the commercial world, if you do something really well that works fantastically, there's a natural persuasion that you keep it to yourself. That's your competitive advantage over everybody else. And in education, people will immediately post a tweet saying, I did this, and here you can download the resources and knock yourself out. And I find that hugely refreshing and something we should really celebrate. But we don't make it easy. Let's be honest. The government and the national system doesn't make it easy. I do want to stress, though, and I've been doing quite a lot of research on not just the systems where I spend quite a lot of my time, particularly the US and Middle East, but Australia and others, comparing and contrasting. And the truth of it is, there's very similar themes in all the elements, in terms of that short-termism, in terms of picking around the edges and tweaking and changing. In that debate where we have local authorities and MATs, and in the state schools we have our school districts and we have our charter schools, and in the international regions we have that contrast between our international schools and our state system, and how we're trying to compare and contrast, and not really recognizing that actually the people running it and the building are really quite secondary to what we're trying to achieve inside that building. And there's some great innovation. I've seen some amazing schools doing some really cool stuff. And I was up at one in the Lake District. I'm sure many will know Matt up at Crosswaite School, which is an outstanding school, albeit I'm not necessarily a fan of the measures, but in his case, I'll give him it because it is an outstanding school. But there's so much more about experience, about children learning skills. They live in a rural community. They're accessing everything from looking after the sheep to beekeeping to linking that with curriculum. And they're not in the jot worried about when the next SATs test is coming up or when the next measure is, because why would you spend valuable learning time teaching to the test? Now, that takes really bold leadership. It takes real strength in terms of how you do that. And certainly within my trust, I consistently answer, although maybe it's easier for me as the chair than as one of the heads, that I much prefer us to have a broader curriculum offer, a broader provision, even if that meant we were slightly down on our Progress 8 measure or our league table scores. And that takes strength to say, actually, look, do we put the thresholds that mean only 40% of our children progress into sixth form, or 80%? Do we have a broader set of options at that stage that allow children to follow more vocational pathways and things that they can achieve at? But the world is changing. More and more young people are looking and going and thinking, actually, hang on a second, I'm going to go and do a paid apprenticeship pathway, degree level apprenticeship. As part of the research I was doing, I was surprised how many people are signing up now in the UK and in the States to 100% digital degrees. We have the Open University, but it's far beyond that in terms of, actually, if you and I wanted to get skilled up on a particular topic now, we would sign up to an online course, we would attend our online sessions, we'd hand in our essays and homework, and at the end of it, we'd hopefully get a shiny certificate. And we'd say, well, that's fine. I'm going to give that guy a promotion now he's got that certificate. And yet, in education, we're very scared of that concept. And I think it's because all our conversations, and I think it applies at university, or whether it's FE, HE and beyond, we're talking about acquisitions of skills, knowledge, information to acquire a qualification. And the truth of it is, in the school setting, just one strand is acquisition of skills and knowledge. And the really important bit is the growing of the person, the child, the whole. And it's the growing of a person that's much harder to do in a non-physical space. So we kind of, ironically, we kind of recognize that there's two parts to the school life of a child from 4 to 18, but we tend to focus all of our measures on one half. When it comes to formal measurements, it's all about that curriculum and progress and how long were they in the building and the rest of it. And there's very little which is about what a brilliant, resilient and well-rounded child. Did this child leave school thinking never again, or with a passion and a love for learning? Did their imagination get encouraged? Did we recognize that creativity is just as important as any other trait? Yeah. You know, as an employer, I rate creativity over, frankly, literacy in many cases. You know, what are we trying to achieve? I've got a spell checker. I've got a tool that will do my text for me. What I haven't got is a tool that can start with a blank sheet of paper and be innovative. I need the human to give that spark.
Oh man, I'm totally with you. You know, my sister worked in Salford, in a Salford school, and that Salford school there was no concept of, you know, how many, you know, well, at that time, how many A's we were going to get and how many B's. You know, it was all about, are we making sure these children, number one, the first thing was safety, obviously, you know, are they all safe? The second thing was, are we actually building their aspiration? Are we building their self-confidence, their belief in themselves? And that's what they were focusing on. There was no focus on, can we get, you know, how, you know, cool. Well, there was always a case of, you know, what grades are they going to get? You know, can we increase those? Can we increase their performance? But I think you're right. I think it comes back to sometimes also kids learn at different paces. And sometimes it doesn't stop at 18. It doesn't stop at 19. Sometimes you learn, like online, as you said, afterwards. If we can create these, you know, these adaptive, so they can basically change, you know, they're willing to change, adaptive, you know, self-confident people who will continue to learn and want to be educated. And, you know, they might, and of course, they're going to choose their own paths, but that's what I think even children do to a large degree. And I know in Finland, they allow them to basically keep on changing their paths. So, you know, if I go, I'm interested in motorbikes, cool. And we'll do, you know, it's all STEM. We'll basically learn the maths as we go along, as well as you building out this sort of motorbike. So, you know, I think ultimately, you know, there's other countries that are already moving this direction, and I fundamentally agree with you that, you know, we need to sort of think about the learner and think about the other side of it, not just about their performance in school or their attendance in school. It needs to be, are they becoming this all-rounded, really self-confident, well, you know, have really strong, you know, good well-being, strong sort of ability to continue to want to learn, and they enjoy basically life, you know, because let's face it, learning is a fun thing. No matter what anyone says, it is a fun thing, and we should all be continuing on to learn.
But it's all come back, sadly, to the same question, which is most schools would love to be able to vary the curriculum offer, broaden it to follow children's particular interests and passion. There's lots of really good work being done on project-based learning, kind of flipping the challenge and creating projects that develop that critical thinking and analytical skills and much more. But it still comes back to the same challenge, which is without the funding and the capacity of bodies and time, the ability to deviate more of the time on the curriculum, the ability to provide the physical resources needed to have more engagement on different children's pathways and learning. If we're at the point where we can't afford to replace the Chromebooks in the classroom, well, providing a course to follow someone's passion on a motorbike is going to be a leap of faith. You know, and we can exaggerate on these things, but the truth is sometimes it is simply about unlocking. And doesn't that come down to the word trust? You know, I think the last few years, the government have done a really poor job in respecting the education profession, not uniquely the education profession. And maybe as a slightly older git now, I can turn around and say, you know, remember the times when you used to respect a policeman, a bank manager and a teacher, you know, and a lot of people will say, well, that's not this world anymore, Al, so get over it. But there is a sense of people don't appreciate the role and remit of our educators. And the government has set a model where there is less parental respect for the value add that they're really doing for their children. That affects recruitment. It often affects retention. Why am I going to keep doing this when nobody appreciates me? And I think, again, there are these subtle things that if government took a different approach of actually respecting and valuing the profession, funding it right, and that trust bit is, well, if you're not willing to give schools more money without conditions, what you're implying is we don't think you'll spend it wisely. Where is your evidence that you're not spending it wisely? Because schools have quite a hefty financial reporting, data and modeling and benchmarking based on thresholds. And we all know that if you get into above 80%, your staff costs are too high. And that's not always as black and white. That measure gets cropped up and mentioned to me so many times. And I kind of think, so a school that's got teachers that are successful and developing in their profession, and because the school's got good culture and values, those people are retained. 10 years down the line, they're all up either M6 or UPS 3 or beyond. And we're saying, well, we've got a higher cost for those same people. Well, is that a bad thing, or is it we've just got some really experienced teachers and we've managed to keep them? I mean, it can work both ways, but I think sometimes there's an element of, come on, you've got to prime the pump. You've got to put the trust and some funding in, and then in parallel have a mechanism to shine a light where that has a positive impact, so it can be then modeled by others. And that's something that can almost become, once it starts, it will grow itself and become self-fulfilling. More and more people will want to show what they're doing. More and more people will want to find ways to innovate with that capacity. At the moment, everyone's hasn't got the time, hasn't got the funding, and frankly hasn't got the will to change some of the big things, because who knows, the government will make another announcement next week and maybe it will change. I mean, I'm quite optimistic at the moment, depending. I mean, this could go out in 2 years' time, in which case I might be changing my mind. But a change of government, sometimes it's not about the color rosette that they're wearing. I think we're at a point where sometimes you just need a change. And that change is healthy, because it's a bit like coasting schools. You can be a high performing school and not doing your best work. I think in education, we just keep falling back on the same things we said 10, 20 years ago. And if it isn't fixed, then stop breaking it. That's me using that adage the wrong way around, but intentionally. We just need to stop harping on some of these things being the panacea to everything, because they're really not.
I agree. I want to, obviously, lots of the people who are watching this will be from the EdTech market as well. And I think there is a role for them to play. And I think, and I want your view on this, in the sense of, I think sometimes, and this comes back to educationists and their time. We talked about teachers, how they can be innovative, and not understand necessarily what tech can do for them. And I think there's sometimes this disconnect between, I think EdTech need to get on board, and there needs to be more conversation between the sort of educationists and effectively their customers and themselves about what is the art of the possible. I think sometimes I think there's this sort of, well, we'll change this for you, and we'll change this for you because you're annoyed by this, or you're annoyed by this. But that's very tactical, and that's very the day-to-day and day-to-day sort of start or changes, change requests, and bugs and so on. When do we get to the point where we go, actually, this is, again, even maybe for government to listen to as well, but this is where actually educationists like to get to. They now understand this is what technology can do for them, and actually this is where they want it to be in 3 to 5 years' time. And actually, government, you need to get on board, because they're going to be using that. And some of that will be great because it'll be efficiencies, but some of it will also be, this is what kids are going to need, because they need to also be ready for the future that's going to be in 3 to 5 years' time. That's, they're going to be adults at the point when this new technology comes on board.
I think we're quite lucky in the UK, because I think we've got one of the strongest edtech sectors that you'll find anywhere, something that is highly respected around the world. Now, being well respected doesn't mean that you always get it right, and you're absolutely right. There needs to be an evolution. My first message to government would be to butt out, and I mean that with a smile on my face, because what tends to happen is whenever we introduce policy, we level down. We don't level up, we level down. Or the government says we're going to intervene and we're going to decide, bypassing all platforms, we'll just create something like Open National Academy. And that is a kind of, well, that's not a competitive model, nor are we saying that that's necessarily better or worse, and everyone can form their own opinion. But
Yeah.
if we steer everybody there based on the fact that there's a free resource you can access, we basically say that's what you should use, and therefore where's the market of innovation gone in our space? When we think about data protection, data privacy, things that are really, really important, generally what happens is policy sits at something where we get the big brands, the international platform providers that all come in and shape it around their needs, and every other vendor then has to try and adapt their products to fit. It
Yeah.
doesn't create opportunity. I think the challenge, and I think there's a real challenge at the moment, is there's been an explosion, courtesy of the pandemic, in the role of technology, both in conversation and in practical application in schools. And that comes with two challenges. You know, the one sense schools say, wow, there's fantastic choice. And at the other side, it's, wow, there's so much choice, I really don't know how to figure out what's good or bad. And I think there's been a little bit of a narrative of a them and us between EdTech and education. They're all trying to sell into it. You know, I've been in the space 30 years wearing hats on both sides of the track. And I've always believed that whether you're working in EdTech in the education space, you do transactions, you do relationships. You start with people on the basis that you will have an ongoing collaboration. And the best products are the ones and the companies that are big enough to say, we co-produce our products. These are not all our genius ideas that we dreamt up in the design room, but this is based on years and years of working with educators, feeling their pain points. So instead of giving you a solution and telling you how you should use it, we'll give you a solution that's specifically aligned to the problem that you shared with us. And there's a change in mindset. There's also a change in mindset, and I think vendors are starting to cotton on. We've spent years, and I'm happily hold my hand up and say guilty as charged for many years, that every year the intent was for us to move on competitively. We need to add more features. And that needed to be a sum of what schools were asking for, what our competitors were doing to respond to that, and what we thought would be something new and innovative. And very much kind of following the sort of Clayton Christensen digital disruption model. You start off with a product that's got the core functionality a school needs, and over time you increment and increment to the point where it's way, way more complicated and larger than the actual features a school are asking for. And that's a fundamentally different shift that then happens. And so vendors have to have two things. First is you have to be bold enough to say, actually, sometimes we have to pivot and reset and recognize that what schools want is simple, scalable, flexible, secure. And we want things that work every time and are easy to use without having to go on a 10-week training course. And that's much more important to us than all the bells and whistles.
Yeah.
And then the second part is vendors need to recognize that it's not a deliver and drop approach. We need to not just say, here's a product that will do X, we need to provide the wraparound. Here are the videos, the webinars, the training, the support to show you how you can weave that into your school to make sure that you've got confidence. And by the way, whilst we're showing you, you might share a couple of ideas that will improve our product in the future. It's symbiotic. And then I think the other thing is being really clear in aligning your product. So we can take the simplistic one, courtesy of everyone having an email about GDPR every minute of every day a few years back. But being really clear on your data protection impact assessments, being really transparent on how your product works, being really clear in terms of what you're adding to the next version, what the expectations are in cost, not requiring customers to sign up to a 5-year contract or a 10-year contract. Making sure that you're really clear about where data is stored and being transparent on it so that people have a right to move. For many years, the main marketing model in the EdTech space, certainly for larger vendors, was to create sticky software. And I should clarify at this point before anybody thinks I've got jam on my keyboard. But you know, sticky software was fundamentally the idea that once you get somebody signed up and used, you make their data so inaccessible that it'd be just too painful to move on. You know, and Amazon is a great example of that. You know, you signed up for your books, then you found it was easy to get your music. And now, although you could sign up somewhere else to get your music, you don't want to leave Amazon because you still want to get your books and your other resources. So in the same way, when companies are creating software for schools, we need to be really driven by empathy and recognition that technology is changing all the time. Schools may well say 2 years from now, there's a different solution or my system has changed and my needs. And so you need to be much more transparent about how you get data out as well as into systems. And I think that's part of something I talk about with schools, and I know you do as well. It's about when you're looking at evaluating technology as part of that kind of rubric of assessment, it's thinking about it being platform agnostic and how it fits across the infrastructure and making sure it doesn't tie you in for the long haul. Because the worst thing for anybody in EdTech is people using your product when they don't want to, feeling that they've been trapped by you, or that they can't afford to move, or it's too difficult to move. Because I guarantee you, in the world of goodwill, your meter is going to fall rapidly. What we want is really happy people and happy customers. And if someone feels there's a better solution and yours isn't the right fit, you should help them on the way, because the odds are they might come back and see you in a few years' time. And I think there's loads in the UK. I'm really proud of the fact there are some amazing EdTech vendors in the UK that give up a lot of time to get involved in the discussion, the dialogue, sharing of resources, where they're not wearing their product vendor badge, they're not selling anything, they're just collaborating. And all the time you're collaborating and sharing, you're also learning. Isn't, osmosis goes on in every kind of event and topic. And I really encourage vendors to recognize that you need to have a mindset of you're going to try and give as much as you take. Now, what you might take will be selling something where there's a commercial payment, but you can give lots in terms of resources and insights and connections and other things that can be just as powerful and helpful to the community. And if you go in with that mindset, then people are much more likely to build a layer of trust with you. And that's something that takes a lot of time. You can't do it in a few weeks. But if you're honest about what your product does, if you're honest about how you store data and process it, if you're honest about how to use it easily, if you're accessible for support and you're accessible to share insights, for me, that's a recipe that lets you differentiate from the largest entities that don't specialize in education.
Absolutely with you. I think education is one of those markets where I think they've long memories. So I agree. I think if they're using your software and they don't want to and they don't like it, but you're tying them in through contracts or whatever it might be, I think ultimately that, when they do go, you're never going to get them back for a very, very, very long time unless somebody comes into that school or Matt and basically doesn't know the history. I think, regarding friction, we always call it friction. You want to get from A to B. So purchasing the product or even understanding that basically you want this particular product because it's going to deliver some value. From A to B, and B being value, you want to be able to go as quickly as possible. And that might mean somebody holding their hands or whatever it might be. But make sure it's as slick as possible, because I think one thing that happens in education, we talked about it before, there's sometimes lots of different solutions out there. And sometimes schools have bought solutions and then basically stopped using them. And they might even still be paying for them. And that has been the case. We've done a lot of stuff with Mac before where you find that. And that's because it's not because they don't need that solution to solve a problem still. It's because it's too hard to get that solution, because people are busy in schools. Teachers are massively bit, their focus is on the child. It's not on let's going to use this tech. So you have to allow them to use that tech easily for them to get the benefit. And if they don't, then I think they'll drop it. And if they drop it, they might still be paying and at the same time, and that just destroys their trust in you as a company. So I was weaving through your conversation.
Yeah. Anybody listening, I'm sorry. I tend to go off on one. And of course,
no.
What does it prove for us? I think, Nick. I mean, this is such an interconnected ecosystem that every action has an effect somewhere else. And I think actually, for once, one of those messages that comes out of conversations like this is we're very programmed to look at a particular problem and how we can mitigate it. And when we're thinking about education, particularly in the context of technology, you have to broaden that view. I use the look through a larger lens analogy, but lots of the things we do outside of the classroom, it's like the word edtech. Well, what do you mean? And people immediately think it's the stuff in the classroom. There's more technology outside of a classroom than in a classroom in a modern school or multi-academy trust. And if all that's working well and greasing the wheels and minimizing friction, what we might do is save some extra money to put into the thing that's really important, the teaching and learning. So being encouraged to step back and think about how these things all connect is really, really important. And if you have aspirations to grow, because that's what the government are expecting of you, then I promise you, if you've got frictionless, flexible IT systems, you'll find it much easier for new schools to come and join you and get the added value of the services you can offer.
Amazing. And I think that is the best bit of advice. I know I've taken up more of your time actually than I intended.
Oh,
So
it's been my pleasure. It's lovely chatting to you.
no, it's been amazing talking to you. And so a big, big thank you from me and all the people who are going to be hopefully listening as well into this. Again, great. It was such an informative session. So thank you very much for talking to me. I appreciate your time. I know you're a busy person, so you got lots going on at the moment, like writing your book. And you should probably be getting on with it now. No, I'm only joking. So
I've got some fresh ideas now, so thank you, Nick.
So it's a massive pleasure, and thank you very much. And hopefully speak to you soon.
Take care.
Take care.